I can't take it anymore. Every single day I wake up to find more of my garden destroyed. 20 years serving this community as a police officer, and this is the respect I get. I've tried being reasonable. I've tried following the proper channels. But you know what? Today is the last straw. You want to mess with my property? With the garden I built with my own 2 hands? Lady, you're about to learn that messing with me and my flowers was the biggest mistake of your life. I promise you this. You will regret ever setting foot on my property. Before we continue, if you enjoy stories about standing up to neighborhood bullies, make sure to click that subscribe button. This is the best way for you to support our work. Thank you very much, and let's continue. Moving to Oak Ridge Estates was supposed to be the beginning of my peaceful retirement. After 22 years serving as a police officer in one of the toughest precincts in Chicago, I'd saved enough to buy a modest home in this quiet suburban neighborhood, the kind of place where children could safely ride bikes in the street and neighbors wave to each other while collecting their morning papers. My name is Marcus Johnson. At 54, with my career in law enforcement behind me, I was looking forward to finally pursuing the hobbies I'd put off for decades. Chief among them, gardening. It might sound silly to some, but throughout my years dealing with the worst of humanity, the violence, the cruelty, the senseless loss, I'd always found solace in growing things. There was something healing about nurturing life after spending so long confronting death. The front yard of my new home became my canvas. I spent weeks researching native plants that would thrive in the local climate. I wanted a garden that would not only look beautiful but would also support local pollinators and wildlife. Coneflowers, black-eyed Susans, butterfly weed, and vibrant zinnias. I selected each plant with care, envisioning the kaleidoscope of colors that would greet me each morning. The work was therapeutic. Digging my hands into the soil, feeling the warm earth between my fingers as I carefully positioned each seedling. It washed away 2 decades of accumulated stress. For the first time in years, I slept soundly through the night, without the nightmares that had plagued me since my rookie year. By mid-spring, my garden was becoming the talk of the neighborhood. People would slow their cars when driving past, and dog walkers would pause to admire the riot of colors blooming across my front yard. Several neighbors even asked for gardening tips, which I was more than happy to provide. It seemed I had found my place in this community. That is, until I met Helen Whitfield. Helen lived 3 houses down, in the largest home on our street, a sprawling colonial with pristine white siding and black shutters. I'd seen her watching me from her window as I worked in my garden, but she never waved back when I greeted her. At neighborhood gatherings, she kept her distance, though I often caught her staring at me with thinly veiled disapproval. Our first actual interaction came on a warm Saturday in June. I was on my knees, carefully weeding around my prized purple coneflowers, when a shadow fell across me. "Excuse me." I looked up, squinting against the sun, to see Helen standing on the edge of my lawn. She wore tennis whites and pearl earrings, her blonde hair pulled back in a tight ponytail that seemed to stretch her features into a permanent expression of displeasure. "Good morning," I said, rising to my feet and removing my gardening gloves. "Toan, right? I'm Marcus. Nice to finally meet you." She didn't take the hand I extended. Instead, she glanced around my garden with obvious distaste. "I'm the president of the Oak Ridge Estates Homeowners Association," she said, as if announcing she was royalty. "And I need to inform you that your garden is in violation of our neighborhood covenants." I blinked in surprise. "I'm sorry? What violation?" Helen produced a folder seemingly from nowhere and flipped it open. Section 8, Paragraph 3 of our HOA agreement clearly states that front yard plantings must be orderly, tasteful, and in keeping with the aesthetic standards of the community. "This," she gestured at my garden as if it were a landfill. "This is not orderly. It's chaotic and, frankly, an eyesore." I took a deep breath, reminding myself that I dealt with far more difficult people during my career. I have a copy of the HOA guidelines, and I followed them carefully. There's nothing that specifically prohibits native plant gardens. In fact, the city has been encouraging them to support local wildlife. Wildlife? Helen's nose wrinkled. "We don't want wildlife," In Oak Ridge Estates, we want property values to remain high, and gardens like yours attract pests. You have 2 weeks to replace this with proper landscaping, preferably a well-maintained lawn with a few tasteful shrubs, or the HOA will issue fines. With that, she turned on her heel and walked away, leaving me standing there, soil-covered and seething. As I watched her retreat to her immaculate home, I felt a familiar tension building in my shoulders, the same tension I'd felt in countless confrontations during my years on the force. But I was determined not to let her ruin my retirement paradise. The next day, I visited the city offices and confirmed what I already suspected. There was nothing in the actual HOA agreement that prohibited native plant gardens. In fact, the city had recently passed an ordinance encouraging such environmentally friendly landscaping. Armed with this information and printouts of the relevant documents, I wrote a polite but firm letter to the HOA board, explaining that my garden was fully compliant with both neighborhood and city regulations. I hand-delivered copies to each board member, including Helen. Most received my explanation with understanding, and several even expressed admiration for my garden. But Helen's reaction was cold fury. As I handed her the envelope, she barely looked at me. "This isn't over, Mr. Johnson," she said quietly. "Some people just don't understand what it takes to maintain the character of a neighborhood like Oak Ridge." There was something in her tone that sent a chill down my spine, a subtle threat that I recognized from years of confronting individuals who believed they were above the rules. But I refused to be intimidated. "I'm sure we can work this out amicably," I replied, maintaining my composure. "I'm always open to reasonable discussion." The next morning, I woke early, eager to continue work on a new section of the garden where I planned to create a butterfly sanctuary. With a cup of coffee in hand, I stepped onto my front porch and froze. Half of my garden had been destroyed. Flowers had been ripped from the ground, their broken stems and petals scattered across the lawn. Months of careful work, obliterated overnight. I set my coffee down with trembling hands and walked through the devastation. Perhaps it was teenagers, I thought, a random act of vandalism. But as I surveyed the damage more carefully, I noticed something strange. Only certain plants had been targeted. My more conventional roses and hydrangeas remained untouched, while the native wildflowers had been systematically uprooted. This wasn't random. This was deliberate. I called the local police, who sent a young officer named Rodriguez to take a report. He surveyed the damage with genuine sympathy. "Any idea who might have done this, sir?" he asked, notepad in hand. I hesitated. I had suspicions, of course, but no proof. And after 2 decades in law enforcement, I knew better than to make accusations without evidence. "No concrete ideas," I said finally, "but I've had some disagreements with the HOA about my garden recently." Officer Rodriguez nodded knowingly. Quatuba, tale as old as time. "Well, we'll keep an eye out." But honestly, without witnesses or camera footage, he didn't need to finish. I knew the chances of finding the culprit were slim. After he left, I spent the day replanting what could be saved and ordering replacements for the destroyed plants. I refused to be deterred. If anything, the attack only strengthened my resolve to create the garden I had envisioned. That evening, as the sun was setting, I installed security cameras, discreet ones that blended with my porch decor but offered a clear view of the entire front yard. If someone targeted my garden again, I'd have evidence. For almost a week, nothing happened. My garden began to recover, and I started to wonder if perhaps the vandalism had been a one-time incident after all. Then, early Sunday morning, my phone buzzed with a security alert. I grabbed it and watched in real time as a figure moved through my garden in the pre-dawn light. Wearing dark clothes and garden gloves, the person was methodically cutting the heads off my newly blooming coneflowers and black-eyed Susans. The camera angle and poor lighting made it difficult to identify the face, but the build and movement were unmistakably feminine. I threw on clothes and rushed outside, but by the time I reached my front yard, the damage was done and the vandal gone. This time, they had been more strategic, cutting flowers rather than uprooting plants, as if trying to ensure the garden would never reach its full beauty. With footage in hand, I returned to the police station. Officer Rodriguez reviewed it with a frown. It's definitely suspicious, he admitted. But the quality isn't great. We can't make a positive ID from this. It's Helen Whitfield, I said firmly. I know it is, Rodriguez sighed. Mr. Johnson, I understand your frustration, but we need more than suspicion. Without clear identification, all we can do is increase patrols in your area. I left the station feeling a familiar sense of helplessness, one I hadn't experienced since my early days on the force, when I'd encountered injustices I couldn't immediately right. But this time I wasn't constrained by a badge and the limits of the law. This was my property, my retirement, my peace of mind. That afternoon, I purchased better security cameras with night vision and motion-activated floodlights. I installed them strategically around my property, ensuring there were no blind spots. And then I had an idea born from 2 decades of watching criminals return to the scene of their crimes, compelled by some psychological need to revisit their handiwork. If Helen was indeed the culprit, she wouldn't be able to resist checking on the damage she'd caused. And when she did, I'd be watching. Sure enough, later that day, I observed Helen through my front window as she walked her small poodle past my house, slowing to examine my garden with a barely concealed smirk. The dog strained toward my flower beds, but she yanked it back sharply, as if my plants might somehow contaminate her precious pet. I needed more than suspicion, though. I needed proof that would satisfy Officer Rodriguez and the local police. And for that, I needed to catch Helen in the act. That night, I slept on my couch, my phone propped up beside me displaying the security camera feeds. Around 2 a.m., movement triggered an alert. I watched, fully awake now, as a figure approached my garden from the street. They wore a hooded sweatshirt despite the warm night, and carried what looked like garden shears. This time I was prepared. I slipped outside through the back door and circled around, staying in the shadows. The figure was so intent on destroying my plants that they didn't notice me approaching until I was just a few feet away. "Hello, Helen," I said quietly. She whirled around, dropping the shears. In the glow of the motion-activated lights, her face was a mask of shock and guilt. "You're trespassing," I continued, keeping my voice steady, "and destroying private property. Both criminal offenses, as I'm sure you're aware." "I don't know what you're talking about," she stammered, backing away. "I was just walking by and noticed someone in your yard. I was coming to alert you." I gestured to the shears on the ground. "With gardening tools? At 2 in the morning? While wearing gloves and a disguise?" Helen's expression hardened. "You can't prove anything." I pointed to the security cameras. "Actually, I can. Every angle of my property is being recorded right now, in high definition. This is the 3rd time my garden has been vandalized, and now I have clear footage of you in the act." For a moment, Helen seemed to deflate. Then, shockingly, her expression twisted into one of contempt. "Your garden is bringing down property values in this neighborhood," she spat. "People like you move in and don't understand how things work here. We have standards, traditions." The implication in her words, "people like you," hung in the air between us. I'd heard similar coded language throughout my career, and its meaning was unmistakable. "I understand perfectly how things work," I replied. "I understand that you believe you can intimidate and bully anyone who doesn't fit your narrow vision of what belongs in this community. But you've made a serious miscalculation with me, Helen." I took out my phone and called the police, maintaining eye contact with her as I reported a trespasser caught in the act of vandalism. Helen's face cycled through emotions: fear, anger, and finally, a calculating calm. "It's your word against mine," she said once I ended the call. "And I've lived in this community for 15 years. I know everyone who matters. Who do you think they'll believe?" "I don't need them to believe me," I said, holding up my phone to show her the live security feed. "The evidence speaks for itself." Officer Rodriguez arrived 10 minutes later, along with a senior officer I recognized from my visit to the station. They reviewed the security footage on the spot and took statements from both Helen and me. "Mrs. Whitfield," Rodriguez said finally, "based on the evidence, we're placing you under arrest for criminal trespassing and vandalism." The look of utter disbelief on Helen's face as she was read her rights was almost worth all the destruction she'd caused. Almost, as the officers led her toward their patrol car, she turned back to me. "This isn't over," she hissed. "You have no idea who you're dealing with." I watched them drive away, feeling hollow despite the vindication. In my years as an officer, I'd seen how the justice system worked. Helen would likely get a slap on the wrist, community service, perhaps a fine, and then she'd return. Her vendetta against me only intensified. The next morning, I woke to the sound of my doorbell. Through the peephole, I saw Helen's husband, Richard, a tall, stern-looking man I'd occasionally glimpsed leaving for work in an expensive suit. I opened the door cautiously. "Mr. Whitfield." "Johnson." His tone was clipped. "We need to talk." I invited him in, and he followed me to the kitchen, declining my offer of coffee. He came straight to the point. "My wife made a mistake," he said, "a serious one, but she doesn't deserve to have her reputation ruined over some flowers." "They're more than some flowers to me," I replied. "And what she did wasn't just vandalism. It was harassment, targeted specifically at me because I don't fit her idea of who belongs in this neighborhood." Richard had the grace to look uncomfortable. "Helen can be traditional in her views, but I assure you, this was about the garden, not about—" He trailed off. "Not about what, Mr. Whitfield?" Impressed. He sighed. "Look, I'm here to make things right. Helen has agreed to pay for all the damage and to formally apologize at the next HOA meeting. In return, we're hoping you'll consider dropping the charges." I studied him for a long moment. Richard Whitfield was not a man accustomed to asking for favors. His discomfort was palpable. "And what guarantee do I have that she won't continue her campaign against me once the charges are dropped?" asked. "You have my word," he said firmly. "And more practically, I've made it clear to Helen that if anything like this happens again, she'll be facing the consequences alone. Our family can't afford the scandal, financially or socially." I considered his offer. While part of me wanted to see Helen face legal consequences, another part, the part that had joined the police force to help build community, not tear it down, recognized an opportunity for something more meaningful than punishment. "I have conditions," I said finally. Richard nodded, clearly relieved that I was willing to negotiate. "First, in addition to paying for the damage, Helen will volunteer 20 hours at the community garden downtown. Second, the HOA will formally amend its guidelines to explicitly permit native plant gardens and other environmentally friendly landscaping. And third, I want a written apology, not just to me but to everyone in the neighborhood for trying to impose her personal preferences as community standards." Richard's eyebrows rose slightly at my terms. "The first and third conditions are reasonable. The second might be more complicated. The HOA board would need to vote." "You're the vice president of the board," I interrupted, "and I've already spoken with most of the other members. They support updating the guidelines to reflect modern environmental values." After a moment, Richard nodded. "Very well. I'll make it happen." We shook hands, and he left, his rigid posture slightly more relaxed than when he'd arrived. True to their word, the Whitfields paid for all the damage to my garden. Helen volunteered at the community garden, reluctantly at first, according to the coordinator, but with gradually increasing engagement as the weeks passed. The HOA guidelines were amended to not only permit but encourage native plant gardens, with my property listed as an exemplary model. Helen's written apology was stiff and clearly crafted by a lawyer, but it was public and unequivocal. At the HOA meeting where she read it aloud, I noticed several neighbors nodding in approval, not at her words specifically, but at the resolution of a conflict that had divided the community. As summer turned to fall, my garden entered a new phase of beauty. The late-blooming asters and goldenrod created waves of purple and yellow, while decorative grasses added texture and movement. Butterflies, bees, and hummingbirds were constant visitors, bringing life and energy to what had once been a static lawn. Surprisingly, other neighbors began to convert portions of their yards to native plants, often seeking my advice. A community that had initially viewed my garden with suspicion was gradually embracing the beauty and ecological benefits of working with nature rather than against it. Even more surprisingly, Helen Whitfield knocked on my door one crisp October afternoon. She looked different, less rigid somehow, with her hair loose around her shoulders and dirt under her fingernails. "Marcus," she said, using my first name for the first time, "I wondered if you might have some advice." The community garden coordinator suggested a particular native grass for winter interest, but I'm not sure it's right for my soil type. I invited her in, and over tea, we discussed gardening, just gardening, without the undercurrents of hostility and prejudice that had characterized our previous interactions. It wasn't friendship, not yet, but it was civil. It was a beginning. As she was leaving, Helen paused on my porch. "I want you to know," she said, not quite meeting my eyes, "that the work at the community garden has been educational, not just about plants, about people too, about community." She hesitated. "I was wrong about a lot of things. It wasn't a personal apology, not exactly, but I recognized it for what it was. A woman raised with certain rigid beliefs beginning to question them. Growth of a different kind than I had been cultivating in my garden, but growth nonetheless. We're all learning," I said simply. "That's what community should be about." Helen nodded and left, walking past my thriving garden without a trace of the disgust she'd once displayed. That evening, as I sat on my porch watching the sunset paint my garden in golden light, I reflected on the journey of the past few months. The conflict with Helen had been painful, but it had ultimately led to positive change, not just in my immediate situation, but throughout the neighborhood. I thought about my years as a police officer, how often I'd felt hamstrung by the limits of the law in creating true justice. Sometimes the system worked as it should, but other times, real change came through confrontation, negotiation, and the slow, difficult work of changing hearts and minds. My garden had become more than just a personal sanctuary. It was a statement, a challenge to outdated norms, and ultimately, a bridge between different perspectives. The flowers and grasses swaying in the evening breeze weren't just beautiful. They were transformative. But I still kept my security cameras active. Some lessons you don't forget after 22 years on the force, chief among them that trust is good, but verification is better. Winter came and the garden entered its dormant phase. Snow covered the seed heads and dried stalks that I'd left standing as shelter for birds and insects. Even in this state, there was beauty, a different kind than the showy blooms of summer, but no less valuable. In January, the HOA held its annual election for board positions. To my surprise, several neighbors nominated me for a vacant seat. Even more surprisingly, I won, with Helen Whitfield herself casting a vote in my favor. At my first board meeting, I proposed the creation of a community garden tour for the spring, highlighting the growing number of eco-friendly landscapes throughout Oak Ridge Estates. The measure passed unanimously. As I was gathering my papers at the end of the meeting, Helen approached me. "Congratulations, Board Member Johnson," she said, with what appeared to be a genuine smile. "I think you'll bring a valuable perspective to our discussions." "Thank you," I replied. "I'm looking forward to working together." She nodded and turned to leave, then paused. "Anne, I almost forgot. The community garden is having a seed exchange next weekend. Several varieties of native plants will be available. I thought you might be interested." "I'll be there," I said. As winter slowly gave way to spring, I began planning the new additions to my garden. The previous year's conflict felt distant now, transformed into something constructive. But I hadn't forgotten the lessons it taught me. One evening in early March, as I was sketching designs for a new butterfly habitat, my doorbell rang. It was Officer Rodriguez. "Just thought you'd want to know," he said after I invited him in. "Helen Whitfield has been doing remarkable work at that community garden downtown. The coordinator says she's become their most dedicated volunteer. Even secured some corporate funding for an expansion project." I smiled. "People can surprise you." Rodriguez nodded. "That they can. Though I gotta say, after seeing the security footage from last summer, I wouldn't have put money on this particular transformation." After he left, I returned to my garden plans with a renewed sense of purpose. The conflict with Helen had been painful, but necessary, not just for me, but for her as well. Sometimes people needed to face consequences before they could grow. As the first crocuses pushed through the melting snow in my front garden, I thought about second chances and new beginnings. In my years as a police officer, I'd seen the worst of humanity, the cruelty, the prejudice, the casual disregard for others. But I'd also witnessed remarkable transformations, moments when individuals rose above their worst instincts to become something better. My garden had been the catalyst for one such transformation, not just in Helen Whitfield, but in the entire Oak Ridge Estates community. What had started as one man's retirement project had evolved into a neighborhood-wide shift toward environmental stewardship and inclusivity. The native plants in my garden weren't just surviving. They were thriving, spreading their seeds and extending their root systems. Change, once established, had a way of perpetuating itself. Spring arrived in full force, and my garden exploded with new growth. The plants that Helen had once tried to destroy returned stronger than before, resilient in the face of adversity. New varieties joined them, gifts from neighbors, findings from the seed exchange, experiments in sustainable beauty. 1 year after moving to Oak Ridge Estates, I stood in my front yard surrounded by a riot of colors and textures that would have been unimaginable to the HOA of the past. Neighbors walked by, offering compliments and asking for gardening advice. Children stopped to observe butterflies and bees going about their vital work. And there, kneeling in her own front yard 3 houses down, was Helen Whitfield, carefully planting what looked suspiciously like coneflowers and black-eyed Susans, the very plants she had once destroyed in my garden. It wasn't perfect harmony. Real life rarely is, but it was progress, hard-won and meaningful. As a retired police officer, I had approached my new community with the wariness that comes from seeing the darker side of human nature. But my garden had taught me something essential about growth and change. Sometimes, the seeds of transformation take root in the most unlikely soil. Despite the difficult beginning, I had found my place in this community, not by conforming to outdated standards, but by standing firm in my values and inviting others to see the beauty in difference. My garden, once a battleground, had become a bridge, and that, perhaps, was the most beautiful bloom of all.